If you're a first-time author, whether you're a children's book author or what, you may struggle with wondering if your first manuscript is really going to sell. Is it a successful story or not? Well, I have something today that I think will help you out, and it's something that I call the primer formula. Now, let me give you some advice right off the bat, and that is that you can't really know from the beginning whether your book will be successful or not. There's a lot of different factors that come into play as far as marketing and how well your cover draws in the reader, different things like that. However, this primer formula can be used when you're first writing your manuscript or even after you finished it to really judge if you have thought of everything within the story to give it that best potential. My name is Travis D. Peterson, and I am a graphic designer as well as an author for children's books. And I just finished a full-length nonfiction how-to book for authors to help you through the process of manuscript to publish. And it's called the Indie Author's Dozen. Now, this book is not released yet, but you can go to indieauthorsdozen.com and you can download the introduction chapter to preview it right now. And this primer formula is something that is really kind of the backbone of this book, you could say, because there's so many different ways that you can use it, not only in judging your manuscript, but also creating content for sharing on social media, for developing your sales page, for beta readers. There's all different ways you can use it. So I just thought I would give you an introduction to the primer formula now. And this is my first time using a whiteboard in front of a camera like this. So we'll see how it goes, and of course, my whiteboard has been drawn on by my kids in the border and all that. So, it's not the best presentation, but YouTube tends to like these whiteboard presentations. And so I thought I'd just give it a try, and you can let me know what you think. But we're going to be looking at the primer formula, which is an acronym for, is that backwards? That's backwards. Hopefully I can flip this around for you. I wrote it correctly. It's showing up backwards on the screen. You know how it goes. Anyways, the primer formula is 6 buckets. So I'm going to draw a little bucket here, right here in the middle. And if you know anything about primer in painting, it's used to just kind of set a foundation before you add the final coat, color, whatever you're wanting to do. And so that's kind of what we're thinking about when I talk about the primer formula. We're setting the foundation for your manuscript. And there's actually 6 different elements or buckets that I'll be explaining to you for the primer formula, and is primer. So let's begin with number 1, which is plot. Now, if you've been writing, I'm sure you're very familiar with what a plot is, and that's just kind of, I like to describe it as the motion of the story. It's not so much about the quality of the words that you use, or it's not so much about is it entertaining, or it's just making sure you have the right pieces and parts for the story to really flow and have that motion. And I like to think, a really great novel has a hook at the end of the chapter that wants you to get into the next chapter. It wants you to keep going through the story. And if you're writing a children's book, that hook should really be on every spread of the book. You might only have 32 pages or 36, 40 pages. And so each spread or each 2-page section of the book should really encourage you to flip the page. It should keep that motion going for the reader to go through the whole story. Now, what I like to say about the plot is a plot hole for a reader is a lot like a pothole for a driver. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, if you're driving a car and you hit a pothole, it can really shake and jar the car, and it might even throw you off track and make you have an accident. Well, the same thing can happen if you have a plot hole in your story. If there's something missing in the story that's just kind of, is throwing the reader off. Well, it might even cause that reader to just close the book and not really be interested in finishing it. So it's that motion from beginning to end, and you want to make sure that all the elements are there to get the reader from the beginning to the end. And of course, you have the very beginning where you introduce the character, and then there's usually some sort of situation that the character is facing that they need to overcome. And so that's kind of the main plot of the story, if you will, until they reach the climax. And then, those conflicts along the way, there may be multiple conflicts. And, 3 conflicts is kind of a great pattern to follow, especially for children's books. But, in a longer novel, there might be many conflicts. But then you get to the climax of the story, and then just after that climax, there is the conclusion of the story. And so there's lots of different factors in the plot that you need to think about, but you definitely don't want to leave anything out. But in my book, I go into a lot more detail about this. But for now, just remember that you want to keep the motion going. You want to keep the reader going through the story. So that's plot. I feel like I'm rambling a little bit with this one, so I'm just going to leave it there. And I think you get what I'm trying to say. So number 2, my pen is already running out. Sorry, I'm fighting a little bit of a bronchitis, so if you hear me clear my throat, that's why. But we got plot first. The second one is readability. Now, what do I mean by readability? I think there's a big difference between readability and legibility. Now, and the way I like to describe this is readability is really your responsibility as the writer. Legibility is my responsibility as the designer. So I want to make sure that all the words are legible on the page, but you need to make sure all the words and the sentences and the structure is readable. What do I mean by that? Are you using words that are good for the age range that you are aiming for? Think about, what grades they may be in, what ages these kids are. Of course, if they're older adults, that's a different story. But you have to make sure that what you're writing fits the age group that you're aiming for in your audience. And also, it really helps, a lot of these books are being read out loud to kids. So is it readable even for adults? And of course, teachers, librarians, parents, they shouldn't really struggle with reading a children's book, but sometimes they can slip up while reading it out loud to kids because maybe the rhyming structure is off or the meter is off. Different things like that can really trip up a reader when they're reading it out loud. So it's good to practice reading your story out loud to see how readable it is. Are there places that you trip up? Maybe you can ask other people to read it out loud and see if they trip up anywhere throughout the text, and that'll really help judge its readability. I'm going to go ahead and move on now to number 3. Can you see that down there? Yeah. All right. Number 3 is I for illustrations. And I've gone from all caps to small caps. That's okay. We're just winging it here, right? So, anyways, illustrations. Of course, this is for a children's book, mostly because that's what I write, and most of my clients are children's book authors. But you could also use the word imagery. Every book has some sort of imagery, even if it's just the front cover design. There's some imagery, even if it's just typographic. It's still imagery. So are these illustrations or is the imagery really fitting for the story that you have? Does it really complement your story? And I like to say that the illustrations should not just be a mirror of your story, but they should be a window. In other words, you don't want to just reflect what you've already written, but you want the illustrations to give a different, a new dimension to the story within the book. I hope that's explaining it well. You hear it often. Often people will say, "Show, don't tell." So when you're writing your manuscript, you want to think of ways to let your illustrations really tell the story even more so than the text itself. So that's kind of the point behind illustrations. And for that, with this point, I also want to say, try to get good quality illustrations. You know, there's a lot of stuff out there that's it's just poor quality. A lot of online services like Fiverr, you have to really be careful because there are illustrators on there who only use stock imagery. Maybe they're using AI to create the illustrations now, which there's a lot of controversy around that right now, and I would just completely avoid AI at all for your book, even writing or illustrating the book. Just completely avoid AI, and that's as far as I want to go with illustrations. But you really want the artwork to complement your story and tell beyond what the words speak. All right, so number 4, we'll come over here. Number 4 will be the message. What is your message? What inspired you to write the book? Is there some deep meaning to it? Now, I like to break up the message into a couple of different parts. There's the benefits, and there's also the core values. Now, let me use my first children's book as an example, Ada and the Helpers. It was inspired by my daughter, who is deaf and has cochlear implants. And so the benefits of it is that it brings awareness to hearing loss and hearing devices. It also teaches the American Sign Language alphabet, finger spelling, things like that. Those are the benefits of the book. But the core message, the core value of the book is that it teaches kids how to help others, the importance of helping others. And so you can see there's a big difference there, but I think there's a combination of your benefits and your core values to create the message of your book. And there's really a balance here. You may have more of one than the other. There may be more of a core value to your book than there is a benefit. Maybe it doesn't really, teach anything like American Sign Language alphabet or something like that, but maybe there's just this value that you present in the story. So there's a balance between those two, but it's the benefits and the core values that make up the message of your story. So what is the message behind your story? What inspires you to write it, and what do you want the reader to walk away with when they finish reading the story? That's something to keep in mind when developing your manuscript. Now, number 5 is education. Now, I like to use the word edutainment here because you know what? I made a mistake. It's not education. It's actually a combination of education and entertainment, but I like the word entertainment here because a lot of books will be educational, but they won't be entertaining. Sorry. I want to underline that because I think it's very important. Books need to be entertaining. Imagine if textbooks were more entertaining for those who were reading them. Wouldn't they just enjoy sort of taking in all that great information? They're full of education, but they may not be very entertaining. So when you have a children's book, you don't want it to be so educational that you forget about the entertainment value of the book. And that's where I think a lot of authors they fail because they try to teach something more than entertain. It still needs to be enjoyable. So don't forget about that. How are you going to entertain? Now, of course, that's very subjective. What entertains me may not entertain you, and vice versa. So you really have to think about your audience and whether they will enjoy reading the story or not. If it's going to be funny, you know, what's funny to you may not be funny to me, like I just said. So you have to really think about what you're writing and maybe test it on some beta readers to see if they enjoy reading it. Is it entertaining or is it just educational? So let's look at number 6 now. The sixth and final bucket is representation. I got a call in the middle of my presentation here and that I had to answer. So I want to go back to number 6 after I've already written it down here, but that's representation. And there's actually 2 different parts of representation that I want to explain, and that is accurate representation and appropriate representation. Now, this is very important to me, and I've already told you about Ada and the Helpers, my first book, which brings awareness to hearing loss. And so representing different disabilities or cultures, minorities, whatever it may be, is extremely important, even if you don't have minorities or disabilities in your story. We still want to honor the cultures that are represented, even if it's a major culture or whatever it may be. You still want to honor the people who are represented no matter what. And so what I like to look at for representation is it accurate and is it appropriate representation? What do I mean by that? For accurate representation, I'll give you an example of a book that I'm working on right now for another children's book author. And it's a book that has a character in it with a prosthetic leg. Now, in the illustrations of the book, this character has a prosthetic on the left leg in 7 of the illustrations. And then the 8th illustration, the prosthetic was accidentally put on the right leg. And so we had to go back to the illustrator and have it redone. And thankfully, we caught that before it was published or anything, so it could easily be fixed. But that's an example of accurate representation. It's making sure that things are consistent throughout the story. I've also seen instances where, like, a wheelchair was not really the proper size for the person sitting in it. It just looked completely disproportionate. Different things like that, you really need to make sure you're accurate on. And that is where you may want to talk to someone who's an industry professional or someone who has some experience with this disability or this culture, whatever it may be, to sort of speak into whether there's accuracy throughout the story. The other side of that is appropriate representation. You want to make sure that you're not promoting any stereotypes throughout your story. And I'm not going to give any examples here. There are all kinds of stereotypes out there. And when those stereotypes are used, they can offend the people who are being represented in the story. And so we just want to make sure that we are honoring the people who are represented, whether it's a specific group of people or a specific person, or even if it's just a fictitious character. We want to honor the cultures that are represented. So think about your story, and does it honor the cultures that are represented? So there you go. There you have it. There is my primer formula. This is totally unscripted, but I hope that it will help you with developing your own manuscript and making sure that your manuscript is just really has a strong foundation for publishing. I love to help authors develop children's books, wholesome children's books that not only kids will love, but adults will cherish. And I believe that if you apply this primer formula, not only will kids love your story, but think about 20 years from now, when those kids are adults and they look back on their childhood, will they think of your story, your book, and cherish their memories of it, as maybe some of the books have in your life? Maybe you look back on your childhood and you say, yeah, I remember that book. That really touched me in a special way. And we want to do the same thing with our books that we're writing now. So that's it. That's the primer formula. I hope it helps. Be sure to go to indieauthorsdozen.com, download the introduction chapter to my brand new book. You'll also be given an opportunity to preview other chapters in the book, including the author chapter, where I go into more detail on the primer formula. And I really hope this helped you today. Thanks.